During inspection of an $80 million prototype jet, Chief Executive Amelia Carter laughed when she noticed Mason Reed, a widowed janitor, staring at a warning screen. Before the assembled board, she mocked him, calling him a man who could not possibly read avionics. Seconds later, Mason quietly pointed out the falsified data stream the entire engineering team had missed. When Amelia dug into his past, she discovered the quiet man who mopped her hangar floors had once built the very system he just exposed. And he was hiding a secret that could still save the company or destroy it. If you believe dignity was never measured by a uniform, stay close as Mason is forced to face his secret. The morning began early at Hangar 7, where the Meridian Vantage X sat gleaming under floodlights, its fuselage catching the pale light of a Dallas dawn. Investors, journalists, and a delegation from a major airline had gathered to watch the demonstration flight that would decide the future of Meridian Aeronautics. The jet represented $80 million of engineering, and more than that, it represented the last chance for the company to escape a financial crisis that had been quietly tightening around it for 2 years. If the flight succeeded, Meridian would secure a contract worth more than $1 billion. If it failed, there would be no second chance. Inside the control room, technicians ran through their final checks. The avionics display flickered, and for less than a second, 2 altitude sensors reported numbers that did not match. The system automatically switched to a backup data pathway, and the warning vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. The central log recorded the event as routine, nothing more than a synchronization delay during startup. Ryan Cole, who led the current avionics division, waved it off without concern. Logan Pierce, the chief operating officer, ordered the warning cleared and the schedule to continue exactly as planned. Nobody in the room seemed inclined to look twice. Mason Reed was mopping the floor near the observation window when the screen flashed. He stopped mid-stroke. His eyes did not go to the red warning text at all. Instead, they settled on a small timestamp in the corner of the display, a detail so minor that no one else in the room had bothered to notice it. Mason recognized something that should have been impossible. 3 separate data packets, each supposedly generated by an independent sensor, carried the exact same absolute timestamp. Independent systems did not behave that way. Not by accident. He stepped forward, his voice calm and unhurried. "The data isn't wrong," he said. "It's being replaced." Ryan told him sharply to step back from the technical area. Logan let out a short laugh and asked, loud enough for the room to hear, what a janitor could possibly know about flight systems. Amelia Carter, already worn thin by pressure from her board, laughed along with him. "A janitor can't read avionics," she said. Several people around her laughed too, the sound rippling through the control room like something rehearsed. Mason did not raise his voice or defend himself. He simply looked at Amelia and spoke with the same unhurried calm. "You can laugh later," he said. "Just don't let that aircraft leave the ground before someone checks data bus number 3. He turned and pushed his cleaning cart back down the corridor, leaving Amelia irritated, though something in her had already begun to shift toward unease. Behind them, the screen flickered again. This time, Grace Walker, the lead test pilot, caught it herself. For a fraction of a second, the display showed a negative altitude reading, even though the aircraft had not left the tarmac. The control room had grown tense in a way that felt entirely new. Reporters lingered near the glass partition, sensing that something had shifted beneath the polished surface of the morning, though none of them yet understood what. Grace demanded the flight be delayed. Logan objected immediately, his voice sharp with the particular irritation of a man who had built his career on schedules never slipping, arguing that a brief glitch was no reason to cancel an event that had taken 6 months to arrange. Amelia, wanting proof that would put the matter to rest, ordered Ryan to check data bus number 3, if only to demonstrate that Mason was wrong. Ryan and his team ran the standard diagnostic. The results came back clean. He announced publicly that there was nothing wrong with the system. Logan could not resist another jab at Mason. Perhaps he should focus on the oil stains on the floor, he said, and a few people chuckled. But Mason had noticed something the diagnostic had missed. The technical team had only tested the hardware, without ever cross-checking the raw sensor data itself. He explained, quietly and without defensiveness, that an intermediary device could be replaying old data, tricking the flight computer into believing every sensor agreed with every other sensor. Ryan asked where he had learned a term like that. "From a mistake I never wanted to see happen twice," Mason answered. Something in the way he spoke made Amelia pay closer attention. He was not trying to prove he was intelligent. He spoke like a man who had already lived through the consequences he was describing, the way a person speaks of a storm they survived rather than one they merely read about. For a moment she forgot the board members watching from the observation deck, forgot the reporters and the ticking contract deadline, and simply listened. She ordered the signal processing module on bus 3 removed for inspection. Inside the housing, Ryan found a small auxiliary circuit board that did not appear on any official assembly diagram. It had been wired directly into the sensor line. Logan moved quickly to explain it away, calling it leftover test recording equipment perhaps forgotten after a previous inspection cycle. Mason studied it through the glass and understood exactly what it had been built to do. It copied stable readings, replayed them whenever the real sensors produced anomalies, and hid the resulting warnings from the central log entirely. That meant the aircraft could report that everything was normal even while receiving genuinely dangerous data. Grace refused outright to fly under those conditions. The event had to be postponed. Investors and journalists began asking pointed questions, and the value of the pending contract suddenly hung in doubt. Logan shifted the blame onto Mason, accusing him of interfering with the testing process to sabotage the demonstration deliberately. Security was called to escort him from the building. Before they led him away, Mason turned back toward Amelia. "Check the identification code stamped on the back of that board," he said. "You'll find the name of whoever ordered it installed." Amelia did not allow Mason to be arrested, but she suspended his employment pending an investigation. She asked Elizabeth Shaw, the company's legal counsel, to pull his personnel file. The file was nearly empty. There was no listed university degree, no aviation experience of any kind, only a scattered history of maintenance work, warehouse labor, and janitorial contracts. Anything from more than a decade earlier was strangely absent, as though someone had reached in and removed it. Amelia wondered aloud whether Mason might be operating under a false identity, but Elizabeth confirmed that every document on file was entirely legitimate. Meanwhile, Ryan examined the auxiliary circuit board more closely and found a string of characters etched into its casing, formatted according to an old internal coding structure Meridian had used years earlier. The final characters read MR-01. In the archive room, Amelia found a folder of design documents dated 14 years back. Most of the digital records had been stripped of authorship, the names quietly deleted at some point along the way. But on one surviving paper copy, a signature remained legible at the bottom of a schematic. Mason Reed, lead systems architect. Amelia stood frozen, the paper trembling slightly in her hand. The archive room smelled of old ink and dust, and the fluorescent light above her buzzed faintly, indifferent to the fact that an entire version of history had just rearranged itself in her mind. Mason was not a man who happened to understand avionics by accident. He had once led the very team that built the company's original avionics platform. An old photograph tucked behind the folder showed a younger Mason standing beside Amelia's father on the day the first prototype had been completed. A section of the image had been trimmed away, and in every version displayed publicly today, Mason had simply vanished. She remembered something her father once told her, long before she understood what it meant. This company exists because of a man who chose to walk away. At the time, she had assumed he was speaking of an investor. Elizabeth warned her not to open a sealed legal box on her own authority. According to her father's will, it could only be unsealed if the company encountered what he had called a Level 3 Aegis authentication failure. The data replay device discovered that morning met that exact condition. Meanwhile, across the city, Mason returned to his small apartment. Evelyn, his 8-year-old daughter, sat at the kitchen table finishing homework and asked why he was home so early. Mason did not describe the humiliation of the morning. He only told her that something at work had gone wrong and needed grown-ups to fix it. Once she had drifted off to her room, Mason unlocked a drawer he rarely opened, the hinge protesting with a small, familiar creak. Inside sat a chief engineer's badge, a photograph of his late wife, an old data drive, copies of 3 avionics patents, and a letter he had written to Amelia's father but never sent. He held the badge for a long moment, turning it over in his palm the way a man turns over a coin he is deciding whether to spend. Later that evening, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "You stayed quiet for 12 years. Don't choose today to become a hero." Amelia went to see Mason herself after work without an assistant, a lawyer, or a security escort trailing behind her. The apartment complex was modest, the hallway lit by a single flickering bulb, and she found herself oddly aware of how far it sat from the polished glass tower where she spent most of her days. Mason did not invite her inside right away. He stood in the hallway, still wearing his work uniform, and asked calmly what the chief executive needed from a man who could not read avionics. There was no bitterness in his voice, only a kind of tired patience, as though he had rehearsed this exact moment many times in his head and found it smaller than he expected. Amelia apologized, though her first attempt still carried the flatness of business necessity. She told him the company needed him to explain the replay device. Mason refused. He believed Amelia only wanted information to protect the contract, not to protect the passengers who would eventually fly on that aircraft. If there had been no investors watching that morning, he said, the leadership would have let the jet take off without a second thought. Amelia pushed back, insisting she had known nothing about the device. Mason answered quietly, "Not knowing doesn't make you innocent, it just means you trusted the wrong person." Slowly, the conversation opened into the past. 12 years earlier, Mason and Amelia's father had built the Aegis Meridian system together, designing it to compare readings across multiple sensors and reject anything that fell outside expected bounds. During one early test flight, a procurement decision had allowed a substandard sensor onto the aircraft. Logan, who oversaw testing operations at the time, ordered a replay device installed to mask the discrepancy rather than delay the program. Mason discovered it and demanded the flight be grounded. Leadership refused to listen. The flight did not crash, but a test pilot was seriously injured when the system fed him false data during landing. Mason had intended to expose what happened. At almost the same moment, his wife was diagnosed with a serious illness. Logan used the company's health coverage, the cost of her treatment, and Mason's position against him, applying pressure until Mason agreed to sign an exit agreement that guaranteed her continued care. After she passed away, Mason became the only parent his daughter had left. He no longer had the strength for a prolonged legal battle against a company with far more resources than he possessed. Grief had hollowed him out in a way that made the idea of fighting for recognition feel almost absurd, a luxury reserved for people whose mornings did not begin with making breakfast for a child who no longer had a mother to do it instead. Amelia asked why he had come back now, disguised as a janitor. He explained that 3 months earlier he had received an anonymous data package showing that the replay device was being used again on the Vantage X. No one would listen to a vanished engineer with no current credentials, so he took the lowest position in the building in order to watch the system with his own eyes. Amelia asked who had sent him the data. Mason said he did not know. Before she left, he offered one final warning. The system had not simply been tampered with once. Whoever was behind it was preparing to trigger a fabricated failure during the next demonstration flight, one severe enough to force the company into a forced sale. Amelia returned to headquarters and, together with Elizabeth, opened the sealed legal box her father had left behind. Inside were a recorded video, founding agreements, patent documents, and a record of shares held within a protective trust. The video revealed far more than Amelia had expected. Mason had not simply been a lead engineer. He was a technical co-founder of Meridian Aeronautics, the man who built the underlying technology while Amelia's father handled capital and business strategy. Mason had once held 18% of company shares. When he left, that stake was never transferred back to the company. Instead, it remained locked inside a protective trust, one designed to activate automatically if the company ever misused the authentication algorithm Mason personally owned. The Vantage X was currently running on a system built directly on top of that very algorithm. Legally, Mason remained the largest individual shareholder outside the Carter family itself. He also retained the right to demand a halt to any flight program if he could demonstrate the technology was being used unsafely. In the recording, Amelia's father admitted that he had failed to protect Mason in front of the board all those years ago. He had left the documents behind specifically so that Amelia would have the chance to correct a mistake he never had the courage to fix himself. Amelia realized that her entire career as chief executive had been built on a foundation created by the very man she had mocked in front of a room full of investors. She sat with that realization for a long moment. The video paused on a frozen frame of her father's face and felt something close to shame settle into her chest like a stone dropped into still water. Elizabeth uncovered something even more dangerous buried within the same files. Logan had quietly proposed selling the Vantage division to a conglomerate called Northstar Dynamics. If the demonstration flight failed, Meridian's value would collapse, allowing Northstar to acquire it for a fraction of its worth. Logan had been promised an executive position once the sale went through. In an emergency meeting, Amelia confronted him directly. Logan denied everything, then pivoted, accusing Mason of trying to seize control of the company by exploiting the crisis to activate his ownership rights. Several board members, already uneasy, found the accusation convenient to believe. A man who had vanished from the industry for 12 years, they argued, had no business making decisions about a modern aircraft. Their objections filled the boardroom with a familiar kind of noise, the sound of people protecting comfort rather than truth, and for a moment Amelia felt the old pull to simply agree with them and let the matter quietly disappear. Amelia stood at a crossroads. She could protect her position and continue the flight schedule as planned. She could expose the secret publicly and accept whatever damage followed to the stock price. Or she could hand technical authority to the one person capable of halting the entire program before it caused real harm. She called Mason into the meeting. Standing before the full board, he did not ask for money, a title, or his shares. He set 3 conditions instead: suspend the flight until every piece of data had been independently verified, bring in an outside safety authority to review the findings, and protect any engineer who came forward with information from retaliation of any kind. Despite threats from several board members that they would move to remove her as chief executive, Amelia agreed to all 3 conditions without hesitation. Mason was granted temporary access to the avionics testing lab. He still wore his old work shirt instead of the suit Amelia had arranged for him, unwilling to perform a version of himself he no longer recognized. The lab smelled of solder and cold coffee, and the low hum of the servers reminded him uncomfortably of nights he had spent in a nearly identical room more than a decade earlier, back when the future had still felt uncomplicated. Ryan bristled at taking direction from a man he had known only as a janitor. Mace never fought him for authority. Instead, he asked Ryan to walk through every layer of the system together, step by step, the way 2 colleagues might rather than a superior instructing a subordinate. Together, they found that the source code had been altered with unusual precision. The real sensor data was still being recorded faithfully in the background. A supplementary algorithm had been added that would flag dangerous readings as temporary interference instead. The system only activated once the aircraft reached a specific speed and altitude. During ground testing, everything always appeared normal. In flight, the system could feed false information for a window of exactly 17 seconds. 17 seconds was more than enough time to push a pilot toward a fatal decision. Ryan slowly understood why Mason seemed to know the architecture so intimately. He had written the original framework the entire system was built upon. Mason never used that knowledge to humiliate him. He told Ryan that a good engineer was not someone who never missed a flaw, but someone willing to admit when the data no longer matched their expectations. Something in Ryan shifted after that. He stopped seeing Mason as a threat and started treating him as an ally, pulling extra monitors closer and working through the night without complaint, the way people work when they finally believe the problem in front of them actually matters. Grace joined them for a full simulation. In the failure scenario they modeled, the aircraft climbed steadily while the real sensors reported a dangerous drop in airspeed. The false data insisted everything remained stable. The automated flight system responded by continuing to raise the nose. Left uncorrected, the aircraft would approach a stall. Mason designed a temporary patch, but he refused to authorize any flight until they found the outside trigger responsible for activating the fault in the first place. Amelia stayed in the lab through the night. She watched Mason work, and it became clear his focus had nothing to do with reclaiming his reputation. His only concern was making certain Grace came home safely. During a quiet moment, Amelia asked whether he ever regretted leaving the industry. He told her he regretted the silence, not the choice to stay beside his wife during her final months, and not the choice to raise his daughter afterward. Amelia admitted that her own father had died while they were still estranged. She had spent years running the company partly to prove her worth to a man who could no longer see any of it. It was the first real point of connection between them, quiet and unforced, carrying no trace of romance yet, only the fragile recognition that both of them had spent years trying to earn something from people who were no longer there to grant it. Ryan eventually traced the activation signal to a transmitter hidden somewhere inside the hangar, broadcasting over the maintenance wireless network. Security footage showed a junior maintenance technician approaching the aircraft earlier that week. By the time they searched for him, he was already gone. The transmitter was still active, quietly counting down toward the rescheduled test flight set for the following morning. Logan called an emergency vote, accusing Amelia of damaging the company and handing control to a man without a current technical license. His voice carried the practiced confidence of a man who had spent decades learning exactly how to sound reasonable while lying. A faction of the board voted to suspend her authority on the spot, and for a moment the boardroom felt less like a company meeting than the closing scene of a trial she had never been allowed to defend herself in. In the confusion that followed, Logan secretly ordered the Vantage X moved to another facility, framing it as protection of company assets. Grace was instructed to fly it there on a short transfer flight. Grace refused without confirmation from Amelia. But the paperwork Logan produced appeared to grant him temporary operational authority. Mason realized immediately that the transfer flight was exactly the opportunity Logan needed to trigger the fault and destroy the prototype, erasing every piece of evidence along with it. Amelia ran out onto the tarmac, but the aircraft had already begun to taxi. Grace noticed a radio control signal in the cockpit that would not fully shut off. The system currently reported everything as normal, but Mason knew the fault would not activate until the aircraft reached 6,000 feet. Mason boarded before the door closed, carrying a portable diagnostic unit. He did not take the controls from Grace. He took the technician's seat behind her instead. Amelia boarded as well, since she alone held the authority to order an emergency landing, and she refused to let Mason face the risk without her. The aircraft climbed smoothly at first. At 6,000 feet, the warnings began. The left airspeed indicator dropped sharply. The right indicator held steady. The system quietly switched to the falsified data source. The flight controller began raising the nose. The stall warning chime never sounded at all. Grace disengaged the autopilot, but the controls felt unnaturally heavy beneath her hands, resisting her the way a door resists when someone unseen is pushing from the other side. Her breathing stayed level even as her knuckles whitened against the yoke, the discipline of 2 decades in the cockpit, holding steady against the rising panic in the cabin. Mason opened the access panel behind his seat and traced the false signal to a backup maintenance conduit that had never been meant to carry live flight data. He told Grace to trust the feel of the aircraft rather than the numbers on her display. Grace eased the nose down, held the throttle steady, and stabilized the jet using nothing but manual procedure and instinct built over 20 years of flying. Mason had to disconnect a module he himself had designed more than a decade earlier. If he cut the wrong connection, every scrap of altitude data would vanish entirely. Amelia noticed his hand trembling slightly. He was remembering the test flight from 12 years ago, and the pilot who had been badly hurt because no one had listened to him in time. That old failure had lived in him quietly for over a decade, folded away beneath grief and fatherhood and the ordinary business of surviving, and now it stood in front of him again, demanding to be answered correctly this time. "You're not alone this time," Amelia said. Mason disconnected the module at exactly the right moment. The false data disappeared, the backup system restored itself, and Grace guided the aircraft safely back toward Dallas. There was no impossible heroics, no single dramatic gesture. The outcome came from coordination, from Grace in the cockpit, Ryan monitoring from the ground, and Amelia steady beside them both. The moment the wheels touched down, security intercepted Logan as he attempted to leave the airfield in his own car. The independent investigation confirmed everything, laying out the evidence with a clarity that left no room for Logan's usual charm to soften it. Logan had ordered the replay device installed, accepted payment from Northstar Dynamics, funneled substandard components through a shell supplier, and planned a controlled failure designed to collapse Meridian's value. He had also erased Mason's name from years of company records and buried the details of the injury that occurred during testing 12 years earlier. Investigators noted that the erasure had not been a single act but a slow, deliberate process, carried out patiently over years, the way water eventually wears down stone. The missing maintenance technician was eventually located and agreed to testify. He explained that Logan had threatened to end his career and strip his family of health coverage if he refused to cooperate. At a company-wide meeting, Amelia stood on the same stage where she had once planned to unveil the Vantage X to the public. She refused to let the communications team write her remarks for her. She told the room, without softening any of it, that she had mocked Mason because of his uniform, that she had confused a job title with a person's worth, that she had nearly allowed financial pressure to matter more than safety, that the company's success had been built on technology Mason created, that Meridian's history had treated him unfairly for over a decade. She apologized to him directly, in front of every employee present, her voice steady even though her hands, gripping the edge of the podium, betrayed how much the moment cost her. There was no applause line built into what she said, no rehearsed pause for effect, only the plain, unadorned admission of a person choosing honesty over image. Mason did not offer forgiveness through some polished, emotional speech. He said simply that an apology only meant something if it was followed by change. He asked the company to restore the names of every engineer who had been erased from its history, to create an independent safety reporting pathway, to protect any employee who came forward about wrongdoing, to build a technical training program for maintenance staff and frontline workers, and to never turn his story into an advertising campaign. Amelia agreed to all of it. Elizabeth publicly confirmed Mason's ownership stake. The board offered him the position of Chief Technology Officer. Mason turned it down for the moment. He said a title, however large, could not undo 12 years of silence, and that he needed time to decide who he actually wanted to become now that the choice was finally his again. Instead, he agreed to serve as a temporary safety advisor, with a flexible schedule that left room for the parts of his life that had nothing to do with airplanes. Later that week, Amelia ordered the trimmed historical photograph in the main lobby replaced with the original uncropped version, the one where Mason stood beside her father on the day their first prototype was completed, finally restored to where he had always belonged. Employees passing through the lobby that following morning paused in front of the frame longer than usual, some of them realizing for the first time that the man who emptied their trash bins at night had quietly shaped the very machines that carried the company's name. 3 months later, the Vantage X program resumed under independent oversight. The hangar filled once again with the steady rhythm of technicians running checks that no longer felt rushed or performative. Ryan officially became head of data verification, applying a principle Mason had taught him without ever writing it down, one he now repeated to every new engineer who joined the team. Don't just ask what the system is telling you, ask why it wants you to believe it. Mason no longer wore a janitorial uniform, but he did not switch to an expensive suit either. He kept to simple work shirts, staying close to the maintenance crews and technicians rather than retreating into an executive office. A new training program allowed frontline staff to study toward technical roles. Mason built much of the curriculum himself, though he refused to let anyone name it after him. Amelia changed the way she led. She started attending safety meetings instead of only reading summaries afterward. She stopped punishing employees for delivering unwelcome information. She required every manager to spend regular time on the production floor. She delayed schedules publicly whenever the technical teams told her they were not ready. Her relationship with Mason grew slowly, through conversations after work rather than any single dramatic moment. Her relationship with Mason grew slowly, through conversations after work rather than any single dramatic moment, the kind of closeness that builds in the quiet margins of a day rather than in grand gestures. There were no obvious scenes of flirtation. The closeness showed itself in smaller ways. Amelia remembered that he took his coffee black. Mason left her a technical note once with a small handwritten reminder to rest. The two of them could sit together in the hangar in comfortable silence without either feeling the need to fill it. Amelia stopped asking him to explain his past before he was ready to share it. Mason slowly began to believe that her change came from genuine responsibility rather than lingering guilt, and that belief settled something in him that had been unsettled for a very long time. Evelyn appeared for the second and final time during a family open house at the hangar, holding tightly to her father's hand as visitors moved past the polished aircraft around them. She handed Amelia a small model airplane that Mason had built for her years earlier, its wings slightly chipped from years of careful play. "My dad says a plane only flies because all its parts trust each other," Evelyn said. Amelia looked at Mason, understanding that the words carried more than one meaning. The scene with Evelyn ended quickly without turning her into a device for resolving the romance between the two adults. Later, Amelia invited Mason to dinner, making clear it had nothing to do with work. Mason hesitated before agreeing, adding one condition of his own: no board members and absolutely no aircraft malfunctions in the middle of the meal. Amelia laughed, a real laugh, unguarded in a way she rarely allowed herself anymore, and told him she thought that condition was one she could finally promise to keep. 6 months later, the Vantage X performed its official demonstration flight. The same hangar that once held mockery and suspicion now filled with a quieter, steadier kind of anticipation. There was no excessive spectacle this time. Before the aircraft took off, Amelia let Grace and the technical team make every decision regarding safety procedure without interference, resisting the old instinct to hover over a moment she no longer needed to control. Mason stood in the operations room. For the first time in 12 years, his name appeared publicly on the list of system architects. Mason Reed, co-founder and original avionics architect. The flight went perfectly. The Aegis Meridian system detected a minor deviation from one sensor, rejected the irregular reading, and switched cleanly to a verified source. The very principle Mason had designed years earlier finally worked exactly as it was meant to. When the aircraft landed, employees broke into applause. Mason did not step forward to accept the credit alone. He called Ryan, Grace, the maintenance crew, and several young technicians to stand beside him. Amelia announced that Meridian would not be sold. The newly restructured board approved a long-term development plan that placed safety ahead of speed for the first time in years. Mason accepted the position of Director of System Safety and Innovation, though only under specific conditions. His hours would never interfere with his responsibilities as a father. He would hold the authority to halt any flight for safety reasons. The training program for frontline employees would continue permanently. And every invention going forward would carry the name of everyone who contributed to it. That evening, the hangar stood nearly empty. Amelia stood beside Mason, watching the Vantage X through the glass. She asked whether he still believed he had trusted the wrong person all those years ago. "I think you're learning how to check the data," Mason said. Amelia smiled. "And you're learning how to give people a chance to make it right." She reached for his hand. Mason did not kiss her immediately. He simply held her hand, a small gesture that carried the full weight of a man finally ready to step out of his past. They left the hangar together, heading toward the dinner that had been delayed more times than either of them could count. Behind them, the aircraft carrying Mason's technology sat quietly beneath the overhead lights. His name was no longer erased. His voice was no longer dismissed, and the secret he had carried for so long was no longer a burden he had to hold alone. The weight he had carried through years of grief and silence had finally quietly come to rest. People once laughed because Mason carried a mop instead of a technical console. In the end, Amelia understood that a uniform could only ever describe what a person did for work, never who that person truly was. This was never just a story about airplanes or boardrooms. It was about the quiet dignity of people who are underestimated simply because of the work they do with their hands. Mason spent 12 years in silence, carrying grief, love for his daughter, and a secret that could have changed everything, and he never once demanded recognition for it. Real strength rarely announces itself. It shows up patiently, in small, honest actions, waiting for the moment when truth finally matters more than fear. If this story reminded you that worth is never measured by a title or a uniform, carry that thought with you today. Look closer at the people around you. Sometimes the quietest person in the room understands more than anyone standing beside them ever imagined.